Let's discuss something uncomfortable. Much food contamination isn't accidental. It's economically motivated fraud or negligence, where profit calculations make contamination a rational business decision. Understanding the economics explains why contamination persists despite regulations and helps identify which products are most vulnerable to fraud. The economic analysis is brutal but straightforward. Compare profit gains from fraud against the probability of detection multiplied by the cost of punishment. If you can make substantial extra profit using diseased animals, extending products with cheap fillers, or skipping expensive safety steps, and the chance of getting caught is low, and the punishment if caught is limited, fraud becomes profitable. This is basic cost-benefit analysis applied to illegal behavior. Companies don't usually frame it this explicitly, but the logic operates whether acknowledged or not. Specific fraud cases illustrate the pattern. The melamine in milk powder scandal in China killed children and caused widespread illness. Melamine, an industrial chemical, artificially inflates protein test results, allowing companies to dilute milk with water and still pass protein testing. The profit from dilution was substantial. The chance of detection seemed low. The result was tragedy. Horse meat substituting for beef in European processed foods saved costs while deceiving consumers who paid premium beef prices. Using sick or dying animals in processed meat, as referenced in your original document, saves the cost of properly disposing of diseased animals while selling their meat. Regulatory capture and enforcement gaps make fraud profitable. When industries have substantial influence over regulators, enforcement becomes lax. When penalties are mild compared to profits, violations become cost of doing business calculations. When testing is infrequent and predictable, companies can time fraud to avoid detection. The food industry operates with relatively limited oversight given its importance to public health, and enforcement resources are inadequate for the system's scale. Understanding which products are most fraud vulnerable helps target skepticism appropriately. Processed foods with complex supply chains are high risk because multiple handoffs create opportunities for substitution and dilution. Products where ingredients are unrecognizable in final form, like ground meat or emulsified products, are vulnerable because consumers can't detect fraud sensorially. Expensive products with cheap substitutes available, like seafood species substitution or olive oil adulteration, face strong fraud incentives. Products with complex international supply chains where origin is difficult to verify face authentication challenges. Consumer protection strategies must assume fraud happens and some percentage of products are fraudulent. Seeking transparency-committed brands requires research but pays off. Some companies voluntarily submit to third-party verification, publish testing results, or maintain traceable supply chains. These practices cost money, so products are often more expensive, but you're paying for verification that cheaper alternatives lack. Recognizing suspiciously cheap prices is important. If you're paying significantly below market rates for supposedly premium products, question why. Someone might be cutting corners, substituting ingredients, or selling near-spoiled products. Blockchain and traceability technologies could prevent much fraud by creating immutable records of supply chain custody and product attributes. The technology exists and works. Industry often resists implementation because transparency reveals uncomfortable truths and prevents profitable fraud. When companies fight transparency measures, that tells you something about what they'd prefer to keep hidden. Consumer demand for traceability can push adoption, but it requires organized pressure. The system won't fix itself because fraud is too profitable. Regulatory reform requires political will that often doesn't exist because industry lobbies effectively. Meaningful penalties that exceed fraud profits would change calculations, but legislators rarely impose such penalties. Better testing would catch more fraud, but testing budgets remain inadequate. The result is that food fraud persists at levels that damage consumer health and trust. Your protection as an individual consumer is limited but not non-existent. Purchase from companies with demonstrated integrity rather than unknown brands offering too good to be true prices. Support regulatory reforms that increase transparency and penalties. Use technology tools when available. Apps that track recalls and safety records help identify problematic brands. Accept that paying somewhat more for verified quality is often necessary because cheap products might be cheap for troubling reasons. The economics of fraud won't change until the costs of fraud exceed the benefits, and that requires enforcement mechanisms that currently don't exist adequately. Until then, informed skepticism is your best defense.